tried to come up with something that would be relevant to the Latin American region to address the topic. Land reform has always been a big issue, either in the forefront or certainly as a subtext of progressive movements, in particular so-called progressive movements, or if I can use the term left-wing government officials, populists. So I wanted to talk about that a bit. And the theme is that the way to escape a great deal of the poverty and oppression in Latin America is to, I'll give this the punchline, I'll give you the punchline before the joke, is to privatize public property. And I think I have a unique proposal for that, and to legalize private property. In other words, to try to put into the hands of people who possess land the legal title so that they can actually activate that land through either using it as a collateral for a mortgage or some sort of backup for a loan. And it changes the incentives and so on. So let's look at this. So of course we put land rights in the broader context of property rights. And property rights is the essential aspect of, I think, libertarian concerns. If we as economists understand scarcity, and then as economists or non-economists understand that scarcity is all about choice, it's the essence of human action. And then what we discover from that simple set of notions and concepts is that private property is the solution to most conflict, the conflict over utilizing scarce resources. So property, unlike in the Marxian context, Marx saw private property as the problem. Libertarians see private property, or good economists see private property as the solution. So it's the solution for conflict and as the basis for the development of social order. Of course, that needs and requires a rule of law, not legislation or government regulation, but a rule of law. A rule of law basically being the absence of privileges, the protection of private property, the enforcement of contracts, and the reduction or elimination of aggression and violence. So that's, these very simple rules give us a very powerful set of principles by which at least libertarians would suggest is the way to live. So within that context of the rule of law, and the primary purpose of the rule of law in terms of protecting human beings is to protect private property. Now, so we start with this idea of self-ownership, which is a concept that we trace back to Locke, of course, and many other philosophers, that everyone rejects the concept of slavery. So implicitly, everyone accepts, virtually everyone accepts, Pear, well, never mind. There's no accounting for Pear's ideas, but let's say that most of us assume that slavery is an evil institution. Now, the implication of that is that not only are you able to control your own destiny, that you have self-determination, but that self-determination requires that you are entitled to possess and utilize anything that comes from the fruit of your labor or through the thoughts in your mind, and that in turn is your property. And if your property is somehow removed or reduced in value, it's implicitly through taxation, perhaps, or some other type of aggression, is a partial enslavement. So that when governments tax us, it's as though that value of our property is worth more to them than it is to us. And that they use the coercive force of government in order to extract it from us, in most cases against our will. So whatever we possess that we have rightfully earned, and that through the merit that's determined through market exchange, we should be entitled to decide on how it is dispersed or utilized or consumed. So land rights evolved because this is sort of a way of trying to elevate the payoffs from investing in land. It's an encouragement for people to improve what they possess. And it's a very strong incentive. If you possess a title to land, you will preserve the value of that land, of that resource, in order to enjoy a future flow of income either for yourself, your family, or your friends. So what we have then, conventions or rules or sort of a set of conditions within a social order emerged spontaneously throughout time to give us this, what we call now the rule of law, that governs property relationships. Now, this idea of land policies and land reform, which, as I mentioned, land reform generally has two elements. Economists or libertarians are concerned about efficiency, that scarce resources are used more efficiently in order to promote the social well-being, to set up the conditions for voluntary exchange, that it leads to the specialization and division of labor, that leads to rising living standards. So these are the sort of textbook examples of the concern for private property. Now, on the other hand, we find in many parts of the world, and especially perhaps in Latin America, that the distribution of, in particular, land tends to favor either oligarchs or historical family units that have held this land since it was granted to them by the king or acquired through some colonial relationships, whatever it may be. So they raise the issue of social justice, this ambiguous term, this dangerous concept that is an empty soup, sort of like pear, that you can put anything in that you can imagine. So social justice has no real theoretical basis. The only concept of justice that I can understand, and I'm not a philosopher, but justice to me can only be measured in terms of voluntary exchange. The outcomes of voluntary exchange are the only rock solid evidence of justice, that it is a just outcome, that both parties are made better off in anticipation and through the execution of those trades. So trying to come up with an idea of social justice, the sort of aggregation of social values, this sort of contrivance of this notion. And it's like Per said about GDP. GDP is the same sort of contrivance that really has no real essential merit in terms of what it offers us. So social justice is this form. And of course, social justice then is the motivation, and in some cases the ammunition, for the kind of populism that we see throughout Latin America. Now, economists, if we look at economists' view on this, the neoclassical economists are all about these government regulations. In my graduate training in economics, whatever the discussion was, the question at the end of this discussion was, but what are the policy implications? I mean, this was even from University of Chicago professors, graduates of Chicago, Virginia, students of Buchanan and Tulloch, and so on that I had. But we find that the policy implications are, what can government do? How can government get involved in this particular issue? And so they're all concerned about these end states, because that's what public policy aims at, these end states, these results. Now, Austrian economists, I presume that most of you in the audience know something about the Austrian school of economics, but they're looking at these processes, the market processes, the outcomes, and how land and land resources fit into that. So we're concerned about tradable rights, property rights, contracting over those property rights, and how incentives within this context of decentralized knowledge will lead to a sense of human flourishment and progress, and the harmony that results, the social harmony that result from these voluntary exchanges. So this is a different perspective on what land policies are all about. So the mainstream economists, and I grew up as a mainstream economist. I say I'm an Austrian by accident. I had no training in it. Perhaps I misrepresented it. But I sort of, through my exposure to the world and of course to the Austrian school, primarily initially through Hayek, I learned social philosophy and political philosophy, I think, from Hayek, and then I learned economics from Mises. That's sort of my sort of approach. So, but we see that I think this is a much more fruitful approach to evaluating not only land policy, but virtually any issue within economics, using the Austrian school concept. So let's look at this idea of ownership and control. First of all, we're sort of stuck with this. I mean, as it is now, governments are, and if you, at least if you're a minarchist or a classical liberal, you would say, well, you know, this government could contribute something here. This could be, in this case, a place where governments could add to there could be gains in terms of economies of scale, in terms of enforcement of contracts through government courts. I mean, one could make that argument in the context if you happen to be a minarchist or a classical liberal. So the gains would be this central provision, not that they are planners in any regard. The central provision simply means there's one agency. You grant a monopoly, just like if you go there and you say, well, we'll grant the monopoly over the legal right to violence to the state, and then we grant them the monopoly. So it's not that far away from that heroic leap into accepting government in that form. So there are high fixed costs to these institutional infrastructure. Institutional infrastructure, of course, is the bureaucracy that oversees the assignment of formal rights, that adjudicates it, and so on, and enforces it as well. So it may be police or whatever. So actually, you know, you start, once you get to that point, you've given up a lot to government. But anyway, I'm going to work within that context because broadly that's what we have. Now, so it works best if there's a standard where there's easy and independent verification, and it may reduce the cost to the individual of enforcing property rights. Of course, you could enforce them with private security agencies, which, of course, by the way, we realize that's what happens in a lot of, especially in Latin America. Governments tax you on the grounds that they, among other things, will provide you with security. But of course, at the end, as in most cases, governments underproduce the things we really would want them to produce, or may want them to produce. And then you wind up having to pay for it by hiring a private security agency or living in a cage, like many people here do. These enormous costs of creating bars and barbed wire and electric fences and so on that you see here. So you wind up paying twice for it. So land rights and land ownership come in three flavors: chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry, right? Now, well, we can have pure private ownership. We can have government ownership that, at least in principle, is on behalf of the collective, the community, the citizenry. And then we have non-governmental or non-market collectives. And this is an idea that has been added, at least in terms of my own sort of thinking about this, by Eleanor Ostrom and her work on these issues where, you know, you may not need either government or the market, that is, or private property, in order to solve collective consumption issues. And that there are very interesting and very complex arrangements. I lived quite a lot on Bali, and the subak system of rice growing is an example that Ostrom looked at that's very instructive. If you have any questions on that, I'll talk about it. So what she was concerned with is to develop this consent within a community to avoid these so-called tragedies of the commons. where that if there's no private ownership, or if there's if in the presence of government or public ownership, that this would tend towards, as Garrett Hardin called it, a tragedy of commons. But in fact, these things are quite avoidable, and that these independent, non-governmental agreements do emerge very often. So communities that have effective cultures, that is, cultures that are cohesive, coherent, and persist, will offer the possibility for this cooperation to occur in absence of either government agencies or private property. Now, the instruments that we see in the real world, unfortunately, because once we minarchists or classical liberals have given up to government, well, then they have central planning. You know, that's one possibility, or so-called smart growth, at least in the United States, whatever that's supposed to mean, is all about sort of a social engineering, where bureaucrats, politicians, green parties, Greenpeace, or whoever it may be, environmentalists, get involved with interfering with private property rights. So the tools they use are confiscation, redistribution, zoning, and so on. Now, again, if you want to occupy the space as a minarchist and classical liberal, the one thing that you would then be interested in is this concept of subsidiarity, where you would have the control at the lowest level of governance. That is, well, the lowest level of governance, of course, is the individual. But you're a minarchist and a classical liberal, you're not an anarchist. So you say, okay, well, we're not going to go there. So it's a local community, the municipality or whatever. And at least if you buy into that approach, that would be a better solution, because they'll be more accountable. There's a greater possibility that you could hold them accountable, and it would tend to be more efficient as a consequence. So, and following what Ken Lee was talking about, the Tebow hypothesis, or voting with your feet, this gives you this greater possibility that you don't have to leave the country, you can simply leave the county or the city. Now, but voluntary contracts are also a way of dealing with this issue, and creating private communities. So there's lots of possibilities. I think many of you must know something about this concept of seasteading, this creation of offshore communities, private communities, where like-minded people would congregate in order to create a living environment that would be congenial to all. Paul Romer, an economist, came up with the idea of charter cities. At Francisco Marroquin, we had developed, and I think it's a bit moribund at the moment, but a Startup Cities Institute, and we spearheaded the development in Honduras of a startup city, which has not yet come to fruition. And of course, Liberland could be an example of that. And I guess my own personal confession is that all these years of having the arrogance and the naivete that my efforts would change society, I discovered they don't want to be changed. And so being a secessionist has increasingly become the most attractive option for me in terms of the escape to freedom. So I don't know whether it's cynicism or reality, but I'm finding myself sort of out of a sense of pessimism about the nature, the fatal and internal contradictions of representative democracy, leading us inevitably towards populism, expanding power of the state, and creating incentives for the state to take ever more resources. There's only one escape, I think. And, well, anyway, that wasn't my purpose of my pitch, but I suppose that was an editorial comment. So let's look at how governments control resources. Well, it's controlled or exploited by a political elite. I mean, the illusion that the people that most people would have about government control of resources. That, you know, whether it's in Latin America, in Thailand had extensive rainforests full of valuable tropical woods from teak and mahogany and so on that were stripped bare by government officials, primarily the military, that had an incentive to exploit those resources as rapidly as possible while they were under their control, because once their tenure ended, they would no longer have the possibility of capturing the value of those resources. So this led to very rapid deterioration in these resources. Had they been held privately, they would have been husbanded over time. They would have been cut and processed according to market impulses. So the political control of land and mineral wealth, which I'll talk about in a moment, because I'm also concerned in this discussion with what goes on below the Earth's surface. The U.S. is one of the few countries, and I think virtually the only, including Canada. Canada doesn't have this. But we have subsoil mineral rights in the U.S., so you can extract resources beneath the soil, which with horizontal drilling, it turns out you can also extract it from people next door. But I don't know how they've solved that issue. I think that's probably coming. So what we find is that in Guatemala, NGOs have come in and meddled with attempts by private companies to receive mining rights to extract minerals, or to drill wells, or to create dams, by stirring up the indigenous sort of outrage over the extraction of minerals from sacred lands and so on. So, you know, again, this is in many ways, not only is it outside interference with domestic issues, but we find that it's an egregious assault on private property. So private claims then are subverted to solve these, you know, public, mostly populist impulses. So governments refuse to give licenses for these mineral extractions based upon not the rule of law, but based upon political pressure. So governments have their own ideological social purposes, maybe social justice, that leads to mismanagement, corruption, and inequality, something that surprises all of you. And of course what happens is that unless you have the perspective that I think is shared by virtually everyone in the room but Per, that when you see a problem, you begin to search for the solution, which is less government involvement, or to search for the policy that caused that distortion, that regulation that Per mentioned, that was perpetuating poverty, that was creating social inequality. One of the interesting problems is governments simply don't know the amount of land that they possess, that they control. I mean, because there's no incentive to actually account for the quality or the quantity. They don't know what's on it. If you own it, you're going to investigate the possibilities for transaction, especially on utilization, especially if you have subsidy. So, why do we want to privatize them? Well, it's to increase efficiency, activate idle resources. I mean, governments around the world, they have lots of land that's never touched, and they keep private users off of it, especially in the United States, where people want to use public land that's adjacent to their own for farming or whatever. Now, one of the things I think we should do is force government agencies to pay the market value of what they utilize. So every government agency around the world, whether it's in Washington or in San Juan, occupy the most valuable real estate in those cities. But of course, they do that because they don't pay the market value for the rent. Now, if they did, they would move out of town and stop adding to the congestion. So if you want to reduce congestion in one of these capitals, force these people to move outside, which you could do simply through this. Of course, like every policy proposal, they have to make the change. So, but anyway, it's still an enticing concept. So one of of the things we have done with this idea of privatization, we said, hey, government official, you'll get the revenues from this. But more important, it's not the revenues from the transfer of public property. It's from the future income flows from taxes that should be attractive to them. But they're not very smart, so they don't necessarily see that. So my idea is that and I had this developing in the Republic of Georgia under Kaka Bendaduki years ago, was to give away public sector assets. And the way you do it, you have a lottery system where you give it away on TV at night. And once you do that, you give away the first piece of private property. It doesn't matter whether it's the housing department, the presidential palace. I don't care what it is, Ministry of Finance. There's no stopping it. This was, with all due respect, a brilliant idea, but it didn't get it done. Now, of course, what would happen is that brokers would come and say, hey, Jose, I'm a broker. What's that? I'm going to sell or lease your property. So this creates a whole new middle class of people and a lot more economic activity. So again, brilliant idea? Okay. Anyway, so, and the reason we're interested in this is that primarily the idea about privatization is not revenues for government in terms of sale or transfer, but activating idle resources. Okay. So the next broad issue here is the subsoil mineral rights. When the state inhibits that, then we have underutilization, lower growth, and what happens is that the private use of subsoil minerals creates private wealth. Is the basis of of what we could call the common good. The best example of this, and where the strongest argument for subsoil mineral rights, is this hydraulic fracturing in the United States, which has, transformed the energy sector of the United States, made the U.S. one of the lowest cost producers of energy. Natural gas is about 1/3 the cost of Europe as a consequence. And this is what's probably kept the ridiculously low growth in the U.S. economy where it is. It would be much worse in absence of this hydraulic fracturing. So, as we all know, many economists use so-called market failure as a justification for government involvement. But subsoil mineral rights have nothing to do with market failure. We don't have a good rationale for it. So economists should be at the forefront of making this argument. It's simply arbitrary. So let's look at this. So the only way we know what market values are is through the market. It's sort of the possibility and process of exchange. You need a common law framework, a rule of law, and the interesting thing about the formalization of title, if you look at Hernando de Soto's work on, in particular, the mystery of capital, he shows very clearly that the poor are the solution. The poor are not the problem. If you allow them to have these land titles formalized, then this process itself will be a real boost to economic development. Now, one of my favorite examples of libertarian activism and that I always look for to inspire young students is through Barun Mitra in the Liberty Institute in India, where he has helped villagers and tribal people acquire formal title to land that their families have occupied for centuries, not simply generations, but centuries in some cases. And this is, as he's described it, a source of enormous human dignity, which I think, we talk a lot about human liberty, but individual dignity should be part of our package that we offer people. So I think I've run out of time. Thank you very much.